Good evening, Erev Tov, and welcome. My name is Erin Coubert, and I'm the Director of Political Affairs at the Consulate General of Israel to New England. It's a great honor to be moderating tonight's commemoration of the late Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, marking the 26th anniversary of his death. We'd like to thank our co-sponsors, including the Fletcher School at Tufts University, Israeli Caucus at Harvard Kennedy School, Israeli American Council, IAC New England, Hebrew College, and Gann Academy. We are gathered together virtually to observe a very sad and painful day in the history of Israel and the Jewish people. I can still remember exactly where I was when I heard the devastating news on that Saturday 26 years ago, and how shocked and heavy-hearted I felt. 26 years from that terrible evening allows us to take a step back and think about the legacy and lessons of Rabin's life. A military leader in Israel, he ultimately came to understand that Israel could not achieve security without peace with her neighbors. He paid for this belief with his life. This evening, we have a very special program for you. First, we will hear remarks from Ambassador Meron Rubin, Consul General of Israel to New England. Next, our special guest speaker, Dalia Rabin, will share thoughts with us. Then, Nili Fish-Bieler of Gann Academy's Shenanigans will perform Shir LaShalom. This will be followed by our keynote speaker, Dr. Sarah Yael Hirshorn of Northwestern University, who will be speaking about Rabin's historic role as a peacemaker and diplomat. We conclude the evening with the Israeli national anthem, Hatikva, performed by Gann Academy's Shenanigans, having the participation of the next generation of young people in our tribute demonstrates how Rabin's legacy lives on. We will now begin with Ambassador Rubin.
Good evening, everyone. It's an honor to welcome you to this special and significant event. In accordance with Jewish custom, we will begin tonight's ceremony by lighting a memorial candle in memory of the late Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. During these tough COVID years, winds of hope are still blowing in the Middle East as former foes are forming friendships. Nothing seems more appropriate in these historic times than to commemorate the life and legacy of Yitzhak Rabin, Israel's fifth Prime Minister, who brought the Jewish state to the brink of peace with the Palestinians through the Oslo Accords and the peace agreement with the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. The heritage that Rabin left us to continue the pursuit of peace and meet Israel's security challenges echoes as we just marked the one-year anniversary of the recent Abraham Accords. Ties between Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco, which are based upon people-to-people relationships, offer inspiration for the future. 26 years ago, Rabin's dream of peace was cut short with his assassination. Keeping his legacy alive through ceremonies such as this is critical to ensure that Israel's ongoing quest for peace with its Middle Eastern neighbors be strengthened. Yitzhak Rabin held many meaningful roles in his lifetime. He was a military leader who, as the Israeli Defense Forces Chief of Staff, oversaw Israel's victory in the 1967 Six-Day War, and a political one, serving as Prime Minister on two separate occasions. In addition, he served as Israel's ambassador to the United States from 1968 to 1973, a period in which he helped deepen United States-Israel ties. It may seem ironic when a military leader morphs into a diplomat, since on the surface, the two approaches might appear antithetical to each other. However, in the case of Rabin, the opposite was true. Those who led others into deadly combat can become the first to battle for peace and diplomacy as they understand the human cost of war and the price that too many have paid to defend the homeland. In referring to the imminent peace with Jordan, Rabin addressed the US Congress and King Hussein of Jordan as follows. I, ID number 30743, retired Lieutenant General Yitzhak Rabin, a soldier in the Israel Defense Forces and a soldier in the Army of Peace. I, who sent regiments into the fire and soldiers to their deaths. I say to you, Your Majesty, the King of Jordan, and I say to you, American friends, today we are embarking on a battle that has no dead and no wounded, no blood and no anguish. This is the only battle that is a pleasure to wage, the battle for peace. Israel's battle for peace is unending. We have always strived to achieve this goal through peaceful means, through diplomacy and dialogue, rather than through bullets and missiles. Rabin's singing of the iconic song Shir LaShalom, which means a song for peace, which he sang at his last public appearance at a peace rally in Tel Aviv on the fateful night of his murder, says it all. We look forward to hearing the inspiring anthem again tonight, sung by Gan Academy student Nili Fish-Bailey. I translate a few words from this heartbreaking song. Do not say a day of peace will come, bring the day. Do not whisper a prayer, so sing a song for peace. Rabin did all he could to bring peace, not through prayers and mere wishing, but through concrete action as a warrior, as a political leader, and as a diplomat. I wish to thank our esteemed speaker, Dr. Sarah Yael Hirschon, who will enlighten us all this evening as to Rabin's diplomatic legacy as a peacemaker. I wish to thank all the Gan Academy shenanigan singers who will lead us in Hatikva at the conclusion of the program. Thank you to our community partners who are co-sponsoring this memorial event with us, the staff at the Rabin Center, and last but not least, my heartfelt thanks to the consulate staff who have worked tirelessly to produce tonight's program. It is now my distinct honor to introduce a very special guest tonight, Yitzhak Rabin's daughter, Dalia Rabin Philosophe, who has carried the beacon of her father's legacy from the day he was so tragically gunned down in Tel Aviv after the peace rally in 1995. Dalia, the floor is yours.
Good evening, dear Ambassador Meron Reuven, and dear friends and lovers of Israel in New England, in the United States. I really would like to convey my appreciation to your initiative to have a special ceremony commemorating my father, who was assassinated 26 years ago. 26 years. Who would believe? My father was leading a peace process. He thought that peace will bring better life to Israeli people. Separation from the Palestinians, independence to each part will be much better for the future of Israeli youngsters. He wanted to put stress on education, research, industry, infrastructure, which he did. He changed the priorities in his second term as Prime Minister. But his big vision was to try and put an end to this dispute between the two people that caused so much bloodshed and so many tears. But this initiative was very difficultly and extremely opposed by groups on both sides. Two sides have extremists to the right that were totally against this process. So in the midst of this dispute, he was shot in the back by a believer, an ideologist who thought that this is the way to put an end to a policy of a prime minister that was democratically elected. Since that terrible day, we try to commemorate him in trying to put an end to violence, as he said that violence is the biggest enemy to democracy. We are trying in the Rabin Center to strengthen the democratic fiber of the Israeli society. So far, Israel is still a very, very divided society. We have a lot of gaps within that we have to deal with today, and this is what we try to do every morning in the Rabin Center. The whole world has gone through terrible pandemic, which made us to think differently about different elements. These days, we are trying to restart our efforts in the Rabin Center Museum to bring back the youngsters and try to convince them always to choose dialogue as a means to solve conflicts. I wish you all the best, and I invite you all to visit our museum in Tel Aviv. Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador, and your crew. Thanks.
Thank you, Dahlia, for your inspiring words. Nili Fish-Bieler is a 12th grader at Gan Academy and a member of Gan Academy's Shenanigans. She will perform Shir LaShalom for us this evening. Shir LaShalom, Song for Peace in English, is a popular Israeli song that expresses the timeless yearning for peace. Nili?
תנו לשמש לעלות, לבוקר להאיר, הזעקה שבתפילות אותנו לא תחזיר. מי אשר כבה נרו ועפר נטמן, בחימר לא יאירו, לא יחזירו לכאן. איש אותנו לא ישיב, מבור תחתית אפל, כאן לא יועילו לו שמחת הניצחון, ולא שירי הלל. לכן רק שירו, שיר לשלום, אל תלחשו תפילה. מוטב תשירו, שיר לשלום, בצעקה גדולה.
Thank you, Nili. I'm now honored to invite Dr. Sarah Yael Hirshorn to speak. She's the visiting assistant professor in Israel Studies at the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies at Northwestern University in Illinois. Her expertise focuses on diaspora-Israel relations, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and Israeli ultranationalist movement.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you to the audience, and thank you, of course, to the Consulate General of Israel to New England for having me here tonight to mark this solemn occasion of the 26th anniversary or Yortzeit of the murder of Yitzhak Rabin, Prime Minister of the State of Israel. On the 4th of November, 1995, at 9:30 p.m., at a rally in what was now known as Rabin Square, Yigal Amir, a law student and ultranationalist activist, fired 2 shots from a Beretta handgun that deathly wounded Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. At 11:15 that evening, a spokesperson of the Israeli government walked out of the hospital in Tel Aviv to face television cameras outside and announced Rabin's death to the media. The government of Israel announces in consternation, in great sadness, and in deep sorrow, the death of Prime Minister and Minister of Defense Yitzhak Rabin, who was murdered by an assassin tonight in Tel Aviv. The government shall convene in 1 hour for a morning session in Tel Aviv. Blessed be his memory. For me, when this moment happened, it was equivalent to the American experience of where were you when President John F. Kennedy was shot. And I can tell you where I was. I was sitting at my kitchen table in the town of Long Meadow in Western Massachusetts, hearing a message being played on our answering machine upstairs. back in the days when we still had answering machines. Given the 7-hour time difference from Israel, it was still the Sabbath afternoon in Western Massachusetts, and a family friend had left a long and very emotional message on our answering machine announcing breaking news reports on American television stations marking the death of Prime Minister Rabin. I remember this moment poignantly, not only because of the content of this message, but because one of the first and only experiences I ever had in my childhood, my parents violated the Sabbath to go and pick up the phone and hear what my family friend had to say, and later to turn on the television to watch the breaking news reports, because the death of Yitzhak Rabin was such a intensely personal and emotional experience for my family that it subsumed any other obligations that we might have. And certainly the death of Yitzhak Rabin very much put me on my own professional and personal journey into the world of Israel studies. Later, in 1997, 1998, I spent the year in Israel as a teenager when the tragic moment lingered. And I still saw Israelis of my own age, other young people in high schools across the country, lighting candles in what is now Rabin Square in Tel Aviv. Even today, I will linger by his grave on Har Herzl, on Mount Herzl, when I'm in Jerusalem. A figure of both a warrior and a diplomat, and a moment in time in his life and his death, and most importantly, of the promise of peace that still lingered in the air along with the sound of the gun being fired, that so deeply influenced my life, both personally and professionally, that brings me to giving this speech today. And on his 26th yahrzeit or anniversary of his death, I'm also keenly aware that for the generation of students I now teach at university, who were not yet born in 1995, who mostly came of age in a post-Oslo, post-Second Intifada, post-Gaza disengagement, and in the US context, post-9/11 era, and who have mostly only known the television version of a cycle of violence in the region covered minute by minute, and the way that social media has now transformed the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict to a absolute 24/7 discussion. That both the man and the legacy of Yitzhak Rabin is something they only read about in history books. And I can never fully teach them that very visceral feeling of hope and change that existed in the decade of the 1990s. But for the purposes of this discussion, I will try and approximate that feeling here tonight. I first want to tell you a little bit about Rabin's interesting and important background that brought him to his role as both a warrior and a diplomat. Born on the 1st of March in 1922, he would be 100 years old this winter in Shaare Tzedek Hospital in Jerusalem. Rabin was unique as one of the few prime ministers of the state of Israel, even up until this very day, that was actually born in British Palestine. His parents, of course, though, were immigrants. We might have known him in a different life as Yitzhak Rubitsov. His father, Nehemiah, who hailed from the Pale of Settlement in the Ukraine, had stayed back home. His father, Nehemiah, also briefly immigrated to the United States. We can imagine a very different life for Yitzhak had he been born here in America, before immigrating to mandatory Palestine as a member of Poalei Zion, the Workers of Zion, and the Jewish Legion. His mother, Rosa, was born in Belarus, a daughter of a staunchly anti-Zionist rabbi, who later rebelled against her parents and her parents' ideology and immigrated to Palestine in the first days of the British Mandate. His parents met in 1920 in Jerusalem, a world of writers and activists like Chaim Yosef Brenner, or for those of you who have read The Tale of Love and Darkness or watched the film, the parents of one of Israel's greatest authors and advocates for peace, Amos Oz. But Rabin only spent the first year of his life in Jerusalem, which had been rocked by the Nebi Rusa riots in 1920, and was raised in Tel Aviv. He might have inherited some of his later political and diplomatic skills from his mother, who became a member of the Tel Aviv City Council in his childhood. Little Yitzhak was given the traditional education of devout labor Zionists, first at a school for workers' children, and then at a kibbutz agricultural school at Givat HaShlosha, and later at the Kiduri Agricultural School, where he trained to be an irrigation engineer. He was even offered a place at the University of California at Berkeley to gain a degree in engineering in 1940. We can imagine a very alternate history here, but he decided to stay in British Palestine to fight in what he saw as an emerging conflict between Jews and Arabs in the Mandate period. Rabin's formative years indeed coincided with some of the signs of emerging conflict between two national communities and one piece of real estate. The aforementioned Nebi Musa riots in Jerusalem in the year before his birth that drove his parents to move to Tel Aviv, the 1929 riots in Hebron, which included the murder of the Jewish community that had lived in that holy city since medieval times, and by his young adulthood, the 1936 to 1939 Arab Revolt. In the meantime, war was also brewing in Europe, and the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, in Free State Palestine, was increasingly polarized by its loyalty both to the British and its own aims for national statehood, culminating in Ben-Gurion's famous aphorism, "We will fight the war as if there is no white paper restricting immigration, and fight the white paper as if there is no war." Rabin himself was learning to fight, first as a young member of the Palmach, the elite force of the Haganah, the labor Zionist paramilitary, which he joined in 1940, and then under the tutelage of other future famous Israeli generals, including Yigal Amnon and Moshe Dayan, while he was a student. As war approached, agricultural labor increasingly became less important than paramilitary activities, although Rabin also found time for a family life, marrying his wife Leah, a Palmach journalist, in 1948. Until now, Rabin's role in the 1948 war remains a subject of debate by historians, including the school known as the New Historians, which, with access to new documents and narratives, offered a revisionist history of the First Arab-Israeli War and a critical approach to national mythology. He began the war in his birth city of Jerusalem, securing what is known as the Burma Road and recapturing Kibbutz Ramat Rachel, a site that today I suspect many of you know only as a wedding venue or as a pool and spa day, but was in fact a very important strategic feature of the war coming to Jerusalem, and to ensure that the whole city did not fall under siege without access to the coastal plain. These could generally be described as more defensive activities. Yet Rabin's activities also took his brigades on the offensive, both in the eternal civil war within the Yishuv, the pre-state Jewish community in Palestine that was very much part of the 1948 conflict. Rabin's troops, in fact, presided over the Altalena affair, which saw the Haganah fire upon an Irgun ship, essentially ending the rivalry between Zionist paramilitaries that would be ultimately consolidated into the Israeli Defense Force, or the IDF that we know today, as well as going on the offensive in the war between the Zionists, the Palestinians, and the combined Arab armies. A position that the Zionists felt was almost like pitting a David against a Goliath. Rabin was also the deputy commander who presided over the brigades that captured the cities of Ramla and Lida, including the expulsion of its Palestinian residents. The new historians have theorized that the Palestinian exodus occurred for a variety of reasons during the 1948 war, including fear, delivering encouragement of Palestinian leadership, expulsion by the Israeli army, the fog of war, and the belief that a short-lived migration might take place rather than a permanent condition. But the episode of Lida, in which Rabin had a critical role, remains one of the most troubling parts of the fledgling Israeli story. Israeli journalist Ari Shavit, in his book My Promised Land, described it thusly: "The conquest of Lida and the expulsion of Lida were no accident. They were an inevitable phase of the Zionist revolution that laid the foundation for the Zionist state. Lida is an integral and essential part of our story. And when I try to be honest about it, I see that the choice is stark. Either reject Zionism because of Lida or accept Zionism along with Lida. I see this moment as deeply influential in Rabin's life and career as both a warrior and a diplomat. I believe he accepted Zionism along with Lida, but never forgot it. And it deeply informed his future life in thinking about a plan of finding peace through security and the need to come to terms with Israel's neighbors and to make peace with them. In fact, at the end of the war, Rabin joined the delegation in Rhodes to negotiate the terms of the 1949 Armistice Agreement, which led to a long-standing peace for the next 19 years. He remained in the military throughout the decade in the 1950s, heading the Northern Command during the 1956 war, where Israel joined France and the UK against Nasser's Egypt, and later became the chief of staff for the Israeli Defense Forces in 1964. After the tumultuous decade of the 1950s, when Israel was truly a fledgling state struggling to come into existence, Israel began to regain her footing in the 1960s. Yet the consolidation of the Cold War and regional development saw the clouds of war gathering over the Kiryat, the military headquarters of Tel Aviv, with Rabin at its helm already by the middle of that decade. Most troubling were intelligence reports emerging from Egypt. In 1953, Egypt had seen a military coup that had dethroned King Farouk with a military triumvirate, including an upstart general named Gamal Abdel al-Nasser, who soon pushed out his compadres to become a kind of military dictator. Despite courtship by both the United States and the USSR, the Pharaonic kingdom had fallen within the Soviet sphere of influence by the 1960s. As historian and diplomat Michael Oren wrote in his book, 6 Days and War, amongst the proximate causes of the Six-Day War was the closure of the Straits of Tiran, an essential trade route, and the ejection of UN forces stationed along the Egyptian-Israeli border. Israel was also receiving intelligence reports about planned attacks from other surrounding Arab states. Moreover, as the cultural historian and journalist Tom Segev has written, the Israeli public saw the possibility of a second Holocaust only 19 short years after the birth of the State of Israel. Two popular wry jokes of the period described the both optimistic and pessimistic views of Israel's future, which went, "Let's invade Cairo, and then what shall we do after lunch?" Or the more sad version of, "Whoever leaves Lod Airport last, could you please turn out the light?" Rabin himself was temporarily overwhelmed by this moment and thought to have induced a kind of temporary nicotine psychosis after smoking cigarette after cigarette, hearing the dismal intelligence reports coming from the Arab world. However, he quickly regained his faculties and led Israel to a massive victory in the 1967 war, repelling the Arab forces with a preemptive strike against Egypt's air capacity in the first morning of the war, and then over the course of 6 short days, recapturing the old city of Jerusalem, defending Israel's current borders at that time, as well as gaining new territories in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights, tripling Israel's land parcel in only 6 short days in June. However, it was the fate of these occupied territories that would preoccupy Rabin for most of the rest of his life as both a warrior and a diplomat. He soon came to the conclusion that the territories could no longer be part of Israel if it was going to cost them peace with their neighbors. These ideas would animate the peace process, which he led over 2 decades later. Yet, in the decade of the 1970s, and following his retirement from the IDF, Rabin transitioned to the role of a politician and diplomat, first serving as U.S. ambassador to Israel during a pivotal period prior to the 1973 war, when he was able to establish good relations with the U.S. government and new outlets for military hardware. After the 1973 war, he became a member of Knesset, briefly serving as a cabinet minister until Golda Meir's government fell in 1974, and Rabin was elected party leader and then prime minister for the first time. Perhaps one of the most notable achievements in foreign affairs during this period was Operation Entebbe, which rescued passengers from a hijacked airliner in Uganda. He also laid the groundwork for future peace accords with an interim agreement with Egypt. Rabin's second government came to an abrupt end, however, in 1977 when he was forced to resign over holdings in a foreign bank account from his term as the the Israeli ambassador to the United States. While it's very hard for us to imagine this today, in those days it was a scandal. And he was forced to resign. Although we can imagine how the Camp David Accords, which he laid the groundwork for in 1975, might have turned out if he had indeed been the prime minister during that pivotal period. Yet Rabin quickly regained his footing, and in the decades in the 1980s, he turned his attention back to war, first serving as the Minister of Defense from 1984 to 1990, where he dealt with the withdrawal of Israeli troops to the security zone after the first Israel-Lebanon war in 1982. Although troops will remain there for nearly 2 more decades at a very high cost to the IDF and the Israeli public. Rabin was also forced to reckon with the first Palestinian Intifada, or uprising, that broke out in late 1987 and lasted almost 3 years. Rabin's policies to authorize the use of force against Palestinian demonstrators did not always find favor in the international community, although the lesson of the Intifada for Rabin may have been that only through peace, rather than through repression, could Israel find a secure future, and the peace needed to be made with Israel's enemies as much as with Israel's friends. This thinking became quite relevant in 1990 when Rabin was once again elected to the Knesset, and a big change was afoot in the international environment with the end of the Cold War. Israel's diplomatic isolation in the decade of the 1980s due to the Lebanese conflict and the growing recognition of the Palestinian national movement also brought changes in the international environment that led all sides to be more open to a new diplomatic process. In 1990, a conference was held in Madrid, bringing all these stakeholders together. And while it didn't yield many tangible results at the time, it brought an opening that Rabin and his government would later capitalize on in 1992 when he once again became prime minister, with a unique labor-led coalition that put the Likud in the opposition for the first time since 1977. In 1993, a series of back-channel secret negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians in Norway culminated in the first major breakthrough of direct negotiation and treaties between Israel and the Palestinian national movement, which would mutually recognize each other in 1993 in what is known as Oslo I, or the Declaration of Principles, which was memorably signed on the White House lawn under the auspices of U.S. President Bill Clinton, presiding over a tense handshake of hands between Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, who would soon become the president of the newly created Palestinian Authority. Itamar Rabinovich, a diplomat with his own storied history as a peacemaker with Syria and many other government positions, who has written a definitive biography of Rabin recently, suggested Rabin was not in fact a man of the left, nor was he a peacemaker. But he believed in order to secure Israel's existence, it had to come to terms with its immediate neighbors. As we've known thus far, Rabin certainly had a long and illustrious career in civil service and military service that prepared him for this moment. But what stands out for me is the assertion that you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. He was honest about the difficulties of the process and gave both the people of Israel and the Palestinians an opportunity to reckon with each other, understanding that they had to go forward based on a very difficult history, but there was a path to peace in the future. That path quickly accelerated during his tenure as prime minister and culminated in several more agreements. The peace treaty between Israel and Jordan in 1994, the Gaza-Jericho agreement also in that year, and what is known as Oslo II in 1995. This second phase of Oslo laid out the 5 core issues: security, territory, Jerusalem, the right of return of Palestinian refugees, and natural resource management, that lay at the heart of the conflict, but also laid out a timetable for a final status agreement within 5 years. These documents also laid out protocols for erecting the Palestinian Authority, redistricting the West Bank to areas A, B, and C with different levels of Palestinian self-governments and Israeli governance, and the redeployment of IDF forces. These confidence-building and institution-building measures were intended to bring both sides to a final status agreement. While the process suffered numerous setbacks along the way, both from the Israeli public and the Palestinian public, and acts of terror by both sides, Rabin appeared in central Tel Aviv on the 4th of November 1995 to continue to rally support amongst the Israeli public, singing a song of peace to the crowd only moments before those shots were fired. But did those bullets kill only the man or his dream of peace? Fortunately, I think his most outstanding contribution from my generation was more in death than in life. He symbolized the hope and understanding that peace could be in reach. But for many others who lived through this period as adults or were contemporaries of Rabin himself, that his life meant everything to the process. And we often think what might have happened had Rabin lived. As an historian, I don't like to indulge in this kind of counterfactual history. The truth is that this option does not exist for us in the real world. He was assassinated, the Oslo process fell apart, and Israel and the Palestinians have had 20 years of a sad and often deadly history since then that we've had to grapple with. But what might have happened had he survived, and what was his role in possibly bringing peace to the region? I think we need to think not only about Rabin, the figure, but also about the conditions and characters that made peace possible at that moment in time in the mid-1990s. The peace process was far more than Rabin, the individual. It was a moment when coalition politics in Israel provided a domestic opening to allow the Oslo Accords to be passed in the Knesset, It was the end of the Cold War, and there were regional conditions that gave Palestinians the opportunity to pursue this course, the path of the two-state solution, which today, looking back upon this decade, we might see as an aberration in the position of the Palestinian national movement rather than the point of view that it held in the 1990s. And there was also a kind of international leadership, including in the United States, that could shepherd the process along. Rabin was at the center of this context, and he brought the will, stamina, and credibility that no other Israeli leader, and perhaps no other Palestinian leader either, has possessed to move this process forward. In that sense, he was truly pivotal, and we don't know what might have happened had he survived. What we do know is that the technical solutions to those 5 core issues of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that were part of the Oslo process remain in place. So as long as both sides continue to be committed to a two-state solution framework, there's not a lot of new thinking that needs to be done, even if times have changed and the situation on the ground has changed. I think all of this could be overcome in the spirit of where there is a will, there is a way, in terms of adjusting the technical solutions to a current reality 26 years after Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin's assassination. But today, we are not only in a contest of technical solutions, we are also engaged in a war of narrative, one that has become increasingly polarized since the decade of the 1990s and the Oslo framework. Another truth is that since the Second Intifada, the ability of Israelis and Palestinians to see each other, both physically and metaphorically, have declined. And it is more and more difficult for both sides to see each other's humanity and understand the challenges that each side face and their desires to fulfill their own respective national aspirations. Our current social media war, in addition to what happens in the region, has only accelerated the alienation of these two populations from what used to be known as the peace dividend or the potential of peace. I think today we need the kind of leadership that Rabin had to offer that could overcome these challenges on both sides and bring their people with them in the process of peace. This is why we so often long for a new Rabin-like figure to come into existence, both for Israelis as well as for Palestinians. In the meantime, though, there has been good news, and things are changing. A year ago, I'm not sure I could have said that we would see peace, if peace between countries that were not truly engaged in a military war, between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, and perhaps, even as was spoken of this week, Saudi Arabia. Who could believe that peace in the Middle East could be so close at hand and that a year from now, our conversation might be entirely different than today? Perhaps certainly not Rabin himself, though I think he would be overjoyed to learn of these wonderful new developments of the Abrahamic Accords and the possible peace dividend in the larger region that may ultimately allow Israelis and Palestinians to come to an agreement sooner than expected. The new Israeli coalition domestically also shows the possibilities of shared society within the Green Line as Israel continues to confront the challenges of being a Jewish and democratic state. Yet clearly 26 years later, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict remains unresolved. I close with some of the last words Rabin himself spoke 26 years ago, fittingly ending his days with singing a song of peace with the words that the peace was not a dream and that it soon may come about on his lips. Al tagidu yom yavo, eviu et hayom, ki lo chalom hu. Don't say the day will come, bring that day about, for it is not a dream, and in all the city squares, cheer for peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hirshhorn, for this fascinating presentation. Thank you all, and thank you to our co-sponsors, the Fletcher School at Tufts University, Israeli Caucus at Harvard Kennedy School, Israeli American Council, IAC New England, Hebrew College, Gann Academy. Our understanding of history and legacy is dynamic, not static. It is our hope that tonight's program honored the contribution and sacrifices of the late Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in a way that has been meaningful to each of you. We ask you to rise as we conclude with our program, Gann Academy Shenanigans, who will lead us in the singing of Hatikvah. May the memory of Yitzhak Rabin be blessed. Yehi Zichro Baruch. Good night and Erev Tov to you all.